Somewhere buried in your phone's settings, there's a string of letters and numbers you've probably never seen, never agreed to in any meaningful way, and never once thought about. It's called your advertising ID, and it's quietly the single biggest reason ads seem to follow you around from app to app, showing you the exact pair of shoes you looked at yesterday inside a completely unrelated game today. Before you go hunting for it, though, let's be clear about what this actually is, because urgent hidden button that tracks you makes it sound like spyware someone secretly installed on your phone. It's not that. It's a real documented built-in Android feature sitting in plain settings menus the entire time that most people simply never noticed because nobody ever pointed it out clearly. Here's how it actually works. Every Android phone gets assigned a unique identifier the moment it's set up, a long string tied specifically to that device rather than to you personally by name. On its own, that string doesn't mean much. The problem is what happens once different apps start using it. When you download a game, that game's built in advertising. Software reads your advertising ID and quietly reports back what you're doing inside that app. When you open a shopping app later that same day, its advertising software reads that exact same ID and reports back what you looked at there too. Individually, these reports look harmless, just app activity tied to a random string of characters. But because so many different apps use the same handful of major ad networks behind the scenes, that identical ID lets all of them link their observations together into a single, surprisingly detailed profile of your behavior, spanning apps that have nothing to do with each other and that you never expected to be talking to one another at all. That's the actual mechanism behind that slightly unsettling experience almost everyone has had at some point, browsing for something in one app, then seeing an ad for that exact same thing pop up somewhere. Completely different a few hours later. It's not your phone listening through the microphone, despite how often people assume that's what's happening. It's this identifier doing exactly what it was built to do, stitching your activity together across apps, so advertisers can target you more precisely and ultimately sell that behavioral profile onward to data brokers who package and resell it again. The good news is that Android actually gives you a real functioning control over this, and it's been sitting in your settings for longer than you'd think. On Android 12 and newer, open your Settings app, tap into Privacy, and look for a section labeled Ads. Inside there, you'll find an option to delete advertising ID. Tapping it does exactly what it sounds like. It wipes that identifying string completely and replaces the tracking mechanism with essentially nothing, meaning apps checking for that ID going forward simply won't get one to work with. If you're on an older version of Android that doesn't offer full deletion, you'll instead see an option to opt out of ads personalization. It's a slightly less complete fix, since the identifier technically still exists in that case, but toggling it on tells apps and Addy networks not to use it for building a targeted profile, which meaningfully cuts down on the cross-app tracking, even if it isn't quite as clean as deleting the ID outright. This single setting alone is worth knowing about, because unlike a lot of privacy advice that requires digging through a dozen different menus, this one genuinely addresses the core mechanism behind most of that cross-app ad targeting in one place. But it's not the only piece of this picture, and if you're going to spend a few minutes in your privacy settings anyway, there are a couple of closely related controls worth checking at the same time, because they work alongside the advertising ID rather than replacing it. The first is your app permissions, specifically location. Head into Settings, then Privacy, then Permission Manager, and look specifically at which apps currently have location access set to allowed all the time, rather than only while using the app. That all the time category is where the real exposure lives, because it means an app can quietly check and log your location even when you're not actively using it, sitting closed in the background. For something like a navigation app or a fitness tracker that genuinely needs continuous location data to do its job, leaving that setting enabled makes sense. For a flashlight app, a photo editor, or a mobile game that has no real functional reason to know where you are 24 hours a day, that same permission is much harder to justify, and switching it down to only while using or revoking it entirely closes off a second, completely separate tracking channel that has nothing to do with your advertising ID at all. The second related setting worth checking sits inside your actual Google account rather than your phone's general settings. Open Settings, tap Google, then manage your Google account and go to the Data and Privacy tab. From there, you'll find web and app activity, location history, and YouTube history. 3 separate logs that, when left switched on by default, quietly build an extensive searchable timeline of where you've been, what you've searched for, and what you've watched, all tied directly to your actual Google account rather than an anonymous device identifier. These aren't hidden exactly. Google discloses them if you go looking, but they're tucked deep enough into account settings that most people genuinely never encounter them unless they're specifically looking for them the way you are right now. There's one more setting worth mentioning. because it comes up constantly in discussions about hidden Android tracking and deserves an honest, accurate explanation rather than exaggeration. Deep in location settings, under location services, you'll find Wi-Fi scanning and Bluetooth scanning, sometimes bundled together, sometimes listed separately depending on your phone. When these are switched on, your phone continues, quietly detecting nearby Wi-Fi networks and Bluetooth devices even when your main location toggle and your Wi-Fi and Bluetooth radios themselves are turned off. Google uses this specifically to improve location accuracy, especially indoors, where GPS signals struggle, essentially building a broader map of device density to pinpoint position more precisely than satellite positioning alone can manage. For most people, the actual benefit of this is fairly marginal, a bit more accuracy in a shopping mall or a parking garage. If that trade-off doesn't feel worth it to you, both scanning toggles can be switched off from that same location services menu without breaking your regular GPS navigation at all. Now, a word of caution, because it's easy to get carried away once you start finding settings like these and start flipping off everything in sight. Turning off your advertising ID and tightening location permissions genuinely reduces cross-app ad tracking and background location logging. And it does so without breaking how your phone actually functions day to day. You'll still get maps, navigation, weather, and every core feature exactly as before. What it won't do is make your phone completely invisible to every form of data collection that exists. Apps you actively use and grant permissions can still see whatever you've explicitly allowed them to see. Your mobile carrier still knows which cell towers your phone connects to throughout the day, because that's simply how phone networks function at a basic technical level. And individual apps can still collect their own first-party data about how you use that specific app, separate entirely from the cross-app tracking that the advertising ID enables. None of that is solved by any single toggle, no matter how many clickbait headlines promise otherwise. What this setting does solve, and solves genuinely well, is the specific, well-documented mechanism that lets dozens of unrelated apps quietly compare notes on your behavior behind the scenes using a shared identifier you never actively agreed to, and until now, probably didn't know existed. That's worth fixing, and it takes about 30 seconds once you know exactly where to look. Deleting the advertising ID doesn't require rooting your phone, installing a shady-looking third-party privacy app, or making any complicated trade-offs. It's an official, Google-built control, sitting in your regular settings, the entire time, that most people simply never encountered because it's never been the kind of feature that gets pointed out clearly, tucked away under a menu label that doesn't remotely hint at what it actually controls. So if you're going to act on one thing from all of this, make it that one. Open settings, tap privacy, tap ads, and either delete your advertising ID outright if you're on Android 12 or newer, or opt out of ads personalization if you're on an older version. Then, while you're already in there, take 2 more minutes to check your location permissions for anything set to allowed all the time without a clear reason, and glance at your Google account's web and app activity and location history settings to see what's actually been logging in the background this entire time. None of it requires urgency in the sense of a ticking countdown or an active threat sitting on your phone right now, but it does deserve attention, precisely because it's been sitting there quietly, doing exactly what it was designed to do, for as long as you've had the phone in your hand, waiting for someone to actually point it out. Let's talk about why this particular setting stayed so quiet for so long, because that part matters just as much as the fix itself. Advertising IDs weren't hidden by accident. They were built specifically to sit in the background, doing their job invisibly, because the entire advertising ecosystem depends on that kind of tracking working smoothly without users noticing or objecting. If every app popped up a clear notification saying this app is about to share your activity with a shared identifier, so advertisers across dozens of other apps can build a combined profile of your behavior, a lot fewer people would keep using it the way they do now. Instead, that agreement gets buried inside long terms of service documents. Almost nobody reads in full, tucked behind vague phrases like personalized advertising or improving your experience, language deliberately soft enough that it doesn't sound like what it actually is. It's also worth understanding who actually benefits from the system. It isn't really the app developers themselves collecting and using this data directly, at least not in most cases. Most free apps embed advertising software kits built by a small handful of major ad networks. Those networks are the ones actually reading your advertising ID, tracking your behavior across every app that uses their kit, and building the profile. The app developer gets a small cut of ad revenue in exchange for embedding that tracking code. The ad network gets a steadily growing, increasingly detailed behavioral profile it can sell access to, and you get ads that feel eerily specific, without ever having been clearly told that this was the trade being made in the background. The entire time you were just trying to play a game or check the weather, This is also where data brokers enter the picture. Data brokers are companies whose entire business model is collecting behavioral and demographic information, often purchased from ad networks and app developers, then bundling it into profiles they sell onward to other companies, sometimes advertisers, sometimes insurers, sometimes parties whose purposes are far less clear. Your advertising ID is one of the most common threads that lets these different data sources get linked together into a single coherent profile in the first place. Deleting it doesn't erase data already collected in the past, but it does cut off the ongoing supply feeding that pipeline going forward, which is honestly the most realistic and achievable form of protection available to an average user without going to extreme lengths. It's worth pausing here to address something people often ask once they understand how this works. Does turning it off actually break anything? The honest answer is no. Deleting your advertising ID doesn't stop apps from working, and it doesn't disable ads entirely either, which is a common misconception. You'll still see ads in free apps after doing this. What changes is that those ads become less precisely targeted, since the underlying tracking mechanism that let advertisers build a detailed behavioral profile is no longer available to them. Some people notice ads becoming slightly more generic or repetitive after making this change, which is honestly a fair trade for a lot of privacy-conscious users and a small price for closing off a genuinely invasive tracking channel most people never agreed to in any meaningful, informed way. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this too, one that goes beyond just this single setting. A huge amount of what gets labeled hidden tracking on phones isn't technically hidden in the sense of being secret or illegal. It's hidden in the much more mundane sense of being buried under menu labels that don't clearly describe what they actually do, sitting several taps deep in settings most people never have a reason to open. Nobody stumbles onto settings, then privacy, then ads, then delete advertising ID by accident while just trying to change their ringtone. You have to already know it exists and roughly what it's called before you'd ever think to look for it. That's not a technical flaw. It's a design choice, and understanding that distinction is genuinely useful the next time you come across another headline promising some secret hidden setting that's supposedly spying on you. Almost always, it's a real, legitimate, disclosed feature, just one that was never clearly explained to the people it affects. If you want to take this a step further, reviewing which apps hold onto microphone, camera, or contacts access for functionality you stopped using months ago is worth doing too. Android's Permission Manager lets you sort by permission type, so you can quickly see every app with microphone access, every app with camera access, and so on, rather than clicking through each app individually. It's a useful audit to run every so often, and it often uncovers permissions granted almost reflexively back when you first installed an app, tapping allow without much thought just to get past the prompt. Ultimately, none of this is about achieving some kind of complete, total invisibility from every possible form of tracking, because that's simply not realistic for anyone carrying a smartphone every day. It's about closing the gaps that are genuinely easy to close, genuinely disclosed if you know where to look, and genuinely worth the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to fix once you understand what they're actually doing. The advertising ID is the single biggest piece of that puzzle for most people, precisely because of how far its effects reach across completely unrelated apps. Delete it, tighten a couple of location permissions while you're already in the settings menu, and you'll have addressed the core mechanism behind most of the tracking that quietly follows people from app to app every single day, all without breaking a single feature you actually rely on.